Good afternoon. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Education. In my role as director of the Research Institute at CCSRE, I extend a warm welcome to all of you. In keeping with the university's recent preventive responses to reduce the spread of COVID, we decided to hold this event virtually. We thank you for your flexibility in accommodating this change, and we're grateful for your presence here today. Before we begin the event, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford University sits on unceded land. We would like to play a short video made by our students that acknowledges this history and continued importance.
Stanford sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe.
This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people.
Consistent with our values of community and inclusion,
We have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible
the university's relationship to Native peoples.
We're thrilled to continue building on 25 years of excellence in research on race and ethnicity at CSRE. Before we start today's Chautauqua, I would like to encourage you to attend our upcoming events. Next week, January 18th at noon, we'll host a research talk with Michael Wilcox titled Muwekma, Narratives, Sovereignty, and the Politics of Erasure. On February 10th at noon, we'll host a faculty seminar with Brian Lowry from the Graduate School of Business on gender backlash and race. February 24th at noon, we'll also host a faculty seminar with a panel of ideal provostial fellows. You will learn about who they are, where they came from, and their research, so make sure that you don't miss it. In the spring quarter, April 28th, we'll have a Chautauqua with Professor Ann Charity Hudley from the Graduate School of Education, featuring her upcoming book titled Talking College, Making Space for Black Language Practices in Higher Education. So an exciting roster of events that we hope to see all of you with us. Now, today's event is part of our Faculty Research Fellows Program, which celebrates new work by Stanford faculty through a quarterly Chautauqua book salon. Today, we're pleased to welcome you to our second Chautauqua of the year. We spotlight and celebrate the work of CCSRE Faculty Research Fellow, Gregory Ablavsky. Greg is a professor in the Stanford Law School. He's the Helen L. Crocker Faculty Scholar and Professor of History by courtesy. His scholarship focuses on early American legal history, particularly on issues of sovereignty, territory, and property in the early American West. His publications explore a range of topics, including the history of the Indian Commerce Clause, the importance of Indian affairs in shaping the US Constitution, and the balance of power between states and the federal government. His book, Federal Ground, Governing Property and Violence in the First US Territories, was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. He's also taught Policy Practica with Elizabeth Reese, our discussant today, providing legal assistance to the Yurok tribe. And the discussant for today's event is our newest colleague in the Stanford Law School, Professor Elizabeth Reese. She is a scholar of American Indian tribal law, federal Indian law, and constitutional law, focusing on the intersection of identity, race, citizenship, and government structure. Her scholarship examines the way government structures, citizen identity, and the history that is taught in schools can impact the rights and powers of oppressed racial minorities within American law. Liz, thank you for your participation today. In a moment, Greg will join us to lay some groundwork on the book, then be joined by Liz for a discussion. We invite you to join the conversation using the chat function to ask your questions. We'll read those out when we get to the Q&A portion of the event. And with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Greg Ablavsky.
Great. Well, thank you to CCSRE, to Daniel, Alfredo, and Heidi for all the logistics and the invitation. Thanks very much to Liz for taking this on and commenting. So I'm joining you this evening from New York City, the Lenape-Hokan, the homelands of the Lenape people, on the other side of the continent. So it's a little dark here already. Let me start by situating the book a little bit, both geographically and historiographically, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint screen here with you. So geographically, the book is about the first two federal territories. And when we think about federal territories today, we probably think about places like Puerto Rico or Guam. But actually, most of the current states within the United States began as federal territories. These were places that were under federal control until statehood. And in the book, I focus on the first two such territories. So the first is the Northwest Territory, which many people might know at least a little bit about, if only because of the famous Northwest Ordinance. And that encompasses much of the present day Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. You can get a glimpse here. I sort of tried to overlay the map of the United States to give you some sense of where we're talking about here, these regions here in the Midwest. The other territory was the Southwest Territory, which is actually much less well known. And it's actually much easier to define as well. In fact, its borders are basically congruent with present day Tennessee. So, and I will say that one of the things I came away with from the book and one of my interventions in the field is that I actually came away thinking that the Southwest Territory is much more interesting and much more significant in understanding the subsequent history, even though the Northwest Territory gets so much more of the attention. So let me turn now to a historian's favorite subject, which is historiography. In other words, how historians have written about the past. I'll try to be brief here because I realize that this is one of the things that historians find endlessly fascinating that non-historians don't necessarily. So the way I situate this book is sort of at the intersection of two different literatures. The first literature is the literature on the history of the federal government. And there's been a resurgence of this literature in recent years, with a lot of people arguing that actually the federal government had much more authority and was more powerful than previous work acknowledged. And the territories play a key role in this account because constitutionally, the territories are places that are under sole federal control. That is, the limits of state authority and of federalism don't apply there. And you actually have quotes like Brian Bala saying that the territories, not the capital, were where national authority lay. The second is the literature on what is called borderlands. And this work shows how contested uncertain tentative power was in these spaces where there was a collision between multiple sovereignties, the sovereignties, of course, most notably of native nations, but also conflicting European and American empires, stressing how these were spaces where actually governments, particularly the state and federal governments, had very little control. And in their description of this, Hamelin and Truitt talk about the fact that they think of borderlands history as everything that state-centered history is not. It focuses on contingency and on uncertainty and unpredictability. And the two places that I focus on here, these territories, were actually some of the classic borderlands of early America, were inhabited by multiple native nations, neighboring European empires, these prior French settlers known as habitants, newer land companies, wandering Anglo-American settlers from neighboring states, the states themselves. They're all competing with the federal government in this space for authority in some very complicated ways. So these two accounts seem to be in tension, maybe even contradictory, but the argument of the book is that at core, they are not. And actually, in some ways, they are mutually constitutive, that is, that they help explain each other. So fundamentally, what the book argues is that if you want to understand the nature and source of federal power in the early territories, you have to begin with the recognition that because the territories were borderlands, they were very complicated, that they were something of a mess, that there were all these groups with longstanding pre-existing rights and claims based on a long history. And that with the advent of the federal territories, these groups turned to federal territorial officials, demanding that these officials resolve their claims. And this process of resolution was a profoundly legal process in which federal officials, and here I'm quoting from the book, controlled the alchemy by which territorial residents' claims became rights under federal law. And this process, I argue, was the basis for federal authority in these first territories, what I dubbed the adjudicatory state. So that's the argument in brief. The book is divided into three parts, and I'll briefly go through those three parts. So the first part deals with property, particularly property in land. So the federal government aspired to create the sort of clear rectangular grid system that you might be familiar with, sort of neatly surveyed lines marching across the landscape that could then be sold. What it found instead was that there were lots of people with pre-existing titles asserting conflicting land rights. And so what the federal government ends up doing in the territories is sifting through those claims, sending out officials to decide their validity. This happens with respect to native lands. This is an image of the attempt to sort of define the boundaries of the Treaty of Holston from 1791. It's true also for the state citizens. These are these very complicated survey lines from the Virginia Military District, where the state of Virginia gave away land, even though these were ostensibly federal territories. And it's also true for the pre-existing French residents, these habitants. This is a map of their land claims in the town of Kaskaskia in what is today Illinois. And so in the process of sifting and adjudicating these conflicting land claims, the federal government comes to play an outsized role in defining and determining property rights in the territories. So the second part is about violence, particularly about it focuses on the violence between the citizens of the United States and indigenous peoples in the territories. And it's from that section that I excerpted a chapter for you to take a look at. So chapters 4 and 5 are about the federal government's effort to police this violence by sort of creating what I call federal sovereignty, by establishing clear federal criminal jurisdiction that in the minds of federal officials would punish both natives and non-natives who committed violence. And what the chapter traces, these two chapters trace, is the way that effort failed, that in fact, the federal government lacked the ability to actually enforce its criminal jurisdiction. And so instead what happens, and I trace this in the chapter that I gave you, is that the federal government instead starts to try to pay everybody off. So some of these are basically, and here you see some of the lists of the payments that the federal government is making. Some of these are basically tort schemes. In other words, they're paying people to try to avoid violence by paying them for, if someone, if a white settler stole a native horse, the federal government would pay the native nations. And they would actually also pay white settlers if native peoples took horses. But there's also these schemes of what are called Indian presents, in which the federal government is distributing goods to native peoples to try to secure their allegiance. And they're also distributing enormous amounts of militia payments going to territorial citizens, also in a bid to try to secure their support. And I think the clearest example of this is what I trace in the chapter, where you actually have two competing petitions from Congress that come on the same day. One from the widow of a Cherokee leader named Skolacutta, who was attacked in an illegal expedition by territorial citizens in the 1790s. And actually a petition also from those very same militia, both asking for federal monies. And what's interesting is that actually both petitioners receive federal monies. Skolacutta's widow, named Betty, receives a federal pension, whereas the militia receive almost $23,000 in payment for this expedition that was undertaken in violation of federal law. What I think is particularly striking about this chapter is the role in fighting over the meaning of the word dependence. So some of you might know that this is a word that comes to be associated with Native peoples and their relationship with the federal government. But I think what's striking is that actually everybody in the territories was both independent, in other words, they were powerful enough to make claims on the federal government, but also in some ways dependent on the federal government. In particular, the territorial citizens were formally dependents of the federal government. In other words, they were not able to vote. They were within this constitutional system. And yet, despite the fact that both sets, both natives and non-natives, are successfully extracting revenue from the federal government, only one group, Native peoples, end up being labeled and considered as federal dependents by white people. The final part is about the transition to statehood. So territorial status was supposed to be this temporary status prior to admission to the Union. And in 1796, Tennessee becomes a state, and then shortly thereafter, a good chunk of Ohio becomes a state as well. And I think what's striking that in this chapter is that these states very quickly start to challenge federal power, especially over property and relations with Native peoples. And there's an intense struggle in which the federal government maintains its sort of abstract authority, but ends up giving states a lot of control in the process. And in particular, Tennessee successfully leverages its authority to basically force the federal government to endorse its claims and sell out the Cherokee Nation, which had been vigorously pursuing and defending its treaty rights. Finally, the epilogue does some important work trying to trace this story forward in times. And the argument here is that what you see over the period of territorial rule is that there are these ad hoc adjudicatory practices that over time harden into systems. There are three systems: the land system, the system of Indian affairs, and the territorial system. And these systems become precedent. They become precedent basically for how federal government's colonialism is going to be governed in the United States going forward. And the territorial system is especially important here, I think, because while all three of these are settler colonial systems, the territorial system embeds what Patrick Wolfe has called the logic of elimination within the very idea of the system. That is, it creates this very powerful idea in the minds of most US citizens that statehood, the transition to statehood is supposed to be this marker of when pluralism and native sovereignty are supposedly supposed to end. And we saw this logic play out not just in the late 18th and early 19th century, but it's a logic that actually endures to the present. That actually we saw in the McGirt case that the Supreme Court just decided. People are still arguing this logic and argument from statehood. Okay. So that's the book in brief. Let me conclude by offering a few broader musings that might be, I think, particularly appropriate for this audience. So the book has been out now for almost a year, and I've had the advantage of receiving some very generous and thoughtful reviews that engage with the book from some different perspectives. And one of the things that actually surprised me is that a couple of readers commented that they thought the federal officials, particularly Secretary of War Henry Knox, came off sympathetically because they saw them as having various good intentions about trying to clamp down on violence and protect Native nations and peoples. And I ended up having some interesting conversations with folks on this topic. And I think it's relevant because it relates to a larger debate that scholars, but not just scholars, have been having about the place of Native nations within the United States, and particularly the early United States. So here, once again, I'll sort of broadly and somewhat unfairly dichotomize. There's one group of scholars that have advanced what we might call the white legend of US colonialism. And this is this idea that the founders respected Native sovereignty, that they sought to protect it in the Constitution, and that the subsequent violence against Indigenous communities was sort of a fall from what the founders had originally envisioned. And then there's sort of a black legend, and that is this idea that from the beginning, the nation's founding and the founding documents were irrevocably committed to the elimination and even destruction of Native peoples. What I think is omitted from both of these accounts, and when we think about the role of the early federal government, was that the federal government wasn't for anything. The federal government was a complicated entity that didn't have a single intent. The federal government was rather, as I put it elsewhere, a tool, a resource, and a battleground for competing views. And everyone, Native peoples, US citizens in the territories, US citizens in the states, and even federal officials themselves were actually fighting over who got to use that tool and how. In other words, I think we need to think more and focus more on politics, not just in the strictly partisan sense, but in thinking about the fight over state power and who got to wield it and how. And the book suggests, I hope, that there were some deep structural reasons why the politics played out the way that they did because of the way that power was arrayed within the system. And I think that hopefully focuses less on individual people and their intentions and more on the political legal tools that these competing groups were able to wield in advancing their agendas, which I think hopefully helps us understand a little bit better why things unfolded the way they did, why when we look back at this complicated history, we can see some of the broad patterns that we see unfolding over the longue durée of US history. So I'll leave it there. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Liz and with all of you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that presentation, Greg, and also thank you so much for inviting me to present about this, or really just have a discussion with you. For those of you in the audience, Professor Ablavsky and I are colleagues at the law school, and as sort of the two specialists in Indian law, there we probably talk to each other about like our work and these types of issues, like more like I probably talk to him more than I talk to like anyone else about my work and work generally. But we really haven't had an opportunity to dig into this book that he's published. So this is actually a really, exciting thing for us to get to do, and for you all to get to be a part of as well. So I hope to ask some questions that will hopefully generate other questions from the audience as well. I thought I would start off by just giving a sort of like preface to situate a bit of Greg's work, both this book and other parts of his work within this sort of larger legal landscape of sort of what it means to be a historian, a legal historian in particular of this period, such as Greg is. And so how we should be sort of thinking about this book and his work within this broader context, not just of sort of scholarship, but also of like contemporary politics and law and the like debates that are happening in the world. And because I really do think that you all should care a tremendous amount about how these very much, old debates are turning into contemporary realities that are quite binding on us. So for those of you who are not sort of enshrined within the legal world, like one of the things that has come to bind us, at least right now with the current Supreme Court, is this idea of originalism in the Constitution, and that, the way that folks thought about the Constitution when it was originally drafted and passed should have this controlling meaning on, what it means from now into forever, basically. And, so the joke that we kind of have is that this sort of turns folks like Greg, who write about this period, into these incredibly important and also incredibly powerful, frankly, folks, because getting this history right and our understanding of this history, particularly around the time of the founding, not only matters because, you know, we care about our origin story and who we are as a nation, et cetera, but it also because it ends up having real world meaning within the Constitution, and how judges are going to be interpreting the language of the Constitution, like the concept of tribal sovereignty, the scope of state sovereignty, et cetera, when those two are coming into conflict. They're going to be asking questions like, you know, what happened when there were contestations early on around the time of the founding between state sovereignty and tribal sovereignty? And without really great work like Greg's, they're not going to have great answers to those questions. So I think that makes this work all the more important as from this sort of legal scholarship perspective. But I also must confess that as reading this, I just as a matter of Native history and Native studies, I think this does another really important thing, which is tell a history that, like a lot of really good history works do, sort of disrupts a lot of things. You know, it tells new stories and presents a sort of new lens on the way that we previously thought about things. So I think in sort of two ways, it sort of makes us think differently, both about what our country and our legal systems are because of how we're thinking about sort of where they came from or how they've evolved. But I also think it sort of reminds us how the way that we currently think about certain institutions, you know, I think one example that stuck out to me was the discussion of the jury system from your book. You know, might not necessarily be the way that folks have always utilized the same kinds of institutions or legal frameworks throughout history. And so in that same way, like history can like remind us that like just the way it is now or the way we think of things isn't always how it has to be or how it has been. And so, you know, in that way, I think, you know, good histories like this can just get us thinking and be really empowering. So with that preface, I wanted to sort of jump off a little bit on some of the things that you said towards the end of your remarks, especially about sort of these great these great men figures in the book and what it was like, and just sort of ask what it was like for you to be writing about folks like this. You know, there are characters in this book like Andrew Jackson and like White, where you know, they played these like horrible roles in the history of Native people, especially, and you seem to sort of, you know, walk a line of talking about them as not really like evil, but like, you know, like they're politicians, and so they're wielding the different choices in front of them, oftentimes in ways that are really just sort of about like their own power or informed by their own experiences. And as much as that seems like the right thing to do from a history standpoint, like how I'm curious for you, especially as an author and a researcher, what it's like to be sort of, I don't want to say like humanizing Andrew Jackson, but you know what I mean, like that. So can you say a word on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I feel like Andrew Jackson was less of a struggle in some ways because I'll be honest, I nothing in the research that did made me feel more sympathetic to Andrew Jackson. I mean, one of the things that was striking about Jackson in particular is actually there's incredible consistency and through line between the early Andrew Jackson and the later Andrew Jackson. That is, even in the 1790s, when, you know, Jackson is a 20-year-old in what becomes Tennessee, he's already writing letters saying we should get rid of treaties with Native nations. These are pointless. We should just impose our will on them. He's heavily involved in land speculation. So I think, you know, nothing in my research made me feel any better about Andrew Jackson. I knew much less about Sevier, who I think is a more complicated figure than Jackson. He's the first governor of Tennessee. He looms large. Actually, later on, he and Jackson fight a abortive duel because that's what happened in early Tennessee politics, is everybody shot at each other. He comes off as pretty unsympathetic as well, although he has a more complicated relationship. There's interesting stories about how this man, who George Washington described as basically being distinguished only for the murder of Indians, was also attended a concert by a Cherokee choir at the Moravian boarding school, and actually wept at hearing this because he found it so beautiful. I don't actually think these are contradictory. In fact, I tend to think these are sort of flip sides of the same coin in some ways. And other people have actually Akil Amar has pointed to the fact that Andrew Jackson adopted a native child as evidence that he was not in fact racist, when we see actually in fact, we're dealing with this litigation right now, how much these are actually part and parcel of the same thing. I think as an author, you have to grapple with the question of how much does piling on to these people, especially in a scholarly historical work, what's the goal, right? In other words, my hope is that I certainly have a voice and try to use it, but I also think that there's not much to be gained as an author in trying to pile on too much in foregrounding my view of these people, rather than letting the reader read the facts and reach their own determinations. And also, again, as with my comments at the end, ultimately, I think this is not the personalities in the history are fascinating and they're really interesting, but ultimately, I think this is a story less about particular people than about institutional power and how it gets arrayed. The final thing I will say on this is that I found the most interesting and complicated figures, the people actually like Henry Knox, who come across as sort of well-meaning, but actually have deeply flawed visions. And what's fascinating about Knox is he genuinely believes that the federal government will serve as an impartial arbiter between Native peoples and white citizens. And it's so obvious from now that how flawed this vision is, but he has such faith and confidence in it. I don't know. I feel like those people actually are maybe the more useful figures for thinking about our current moment, right? People who find themselves in this situation with power, who ostensibly are trying to do the right thing, but who are unable to transcend the limitations of their own perspectives on these questions.
Interesting. I think that and pivots to another thing I wanted to ask about, which is I really like the frame of sort of thinking about the federal government and sort of federal power and federal money, especially as a resource. I think it's a tricky one, and so I want to probably come back to puzzling around how it functions as a resource. But certainly one of the things that it is a resource that people have unequal access to, or unequal abilities to take advantage of, and that's certainly a part of this narrative, right? And so, what do you think that this story of the federal government, sort of building itself, into existence in a lot of ways through, people using it, but still, that unequal access to federal money and federal power, particularly between white territorial citizens and Native people and nations, what does it say about sort of structural inequalities and how they tend to perpetuate themselves?
So one thing I was struck by, and I think it's important to stress, is that, early on, I think it's remarkable, and we shouldn't minimize how good Native peoples were at getting access to those federal resources, right? That there's no question that the access was unequal, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, but Native power was real. The federal government was dependent on it. And So the amount of money going into Indian country from the federal government was actually quite substantial even early on. And the Native peoples were very good at leveraging what power they had to extract those resources. I think that where the inequality comes into play is when you, especially later on, you see, especially in once these territories become states, you see how the idea of statehood itself and the privileged position that states have, both structurally as being part of the federal government, as being able to not only vote, but have representatives in Congress, but also the legal doctrines that develop around the ideas of statehood, right? The equal footing doctrine and these other legal concepts, even the idea of state sovereignty, which plays such a large role. These are extremely powerful tools for extracting things from the federal government. And I think one of the, where the way I trace this forward is when I think about the fights over the process that gets euphemized as removal in the 1830s, which is really just in some ways, I think, a continuation of the processes that begin before this period, but also continue on through the period that I trace. I really think removal in some ways is a continuation of this fight between Native peoples and the states for the support of the federal government. And what's striking is that states are able to leverage this very powerful set of tools that they have to get the federal government to endorse their claims. Native peoples are very good at resisting that, right? I mean, I think we can't downplay the extent to which the Cherokee Nation and others, they build a nationwide political coalition. They have supporters across the country. They actually have a lot of advocates within Congress, but they are shut out of the halls of power from direct representation. Whereas people like we had this conversation, like Hugh Lawson White, who is one of these people who's engaged in these early militia expeditions, he's actually writing these reports. And I think that structural inequality matters a great deal for how events unfold over this history.
Yeah, I mentioned at some point that as I was reading this, I to you that I appreciated that there were a fair number of like puns in some of the titles of or at least the subheadings within chapters of the book, and I feel like there's like a missing one though, which is that I'm workshopping for when you rewrite it.
Second edition.
But that about this this idea that they're the inevitability of statehood, but also it's like this state of whiteness that's going to happen, where like the states will become white, but also be in a state of whiteness. You're getting what I'm saying.
Yeah, and the fact that his name is White also, does also set up.
It's right there. But it does. It seems like that, especially at this moment, that statehood especially exemplifies that citizenship. I mean, citizenship, I think, in one way was like one level, but then once statehood happens and that citizenship translates into voting for a representative, where I think you describe it as sort of the military power that Native nations were wielding, completely giving way to the political power that now these white territorial citizens have as citizens of a state, voters in a state. But, it seems like that's also this, it's an interesting way in which there was structural inequalities are also creating like new structures of inequality that was really striking to me, because there were I don't know, there seemed to be a missing answer to sort of why why the citizenship of Native people seemed completely off the table, or that the creation of a Native state was off the table at the time. Yet, and so I wonder if you have any response to that question. Where is the where is the that power translating into something else structural, because it seems to kind of just sort of die.
So so that's a great point, and it's there. The idea is floating around at the edges. We have, of course, as you well know, but maybe the audience doesn't, the promises in some of the treaties at this time period that Native peoples will in fact have deputies in Congress. Never realized the Cherokee Nation is now trying to realize this today. But I also think and actually schemes and ideas about the idea that Native peoples will form a state of their own are actually floating around throughout the 19th century history of the United States. That this is a form of power that people are thinking about. And I've explored that a little bit in a short symposium piece I wrote elsewhere. The challenge is that from the beginning, both the ideas of citizenship and statehood are in fact bound up precisely with the ideas of whiteness that you flagged before. And in some ways, I actually think statehood is the more important category at this particular moment than citizenship. Citizenship doesn't loom nearly so large as a legal category until later in the 19th century, until really, I'd say, the era of Dred Scott. And it's statehood that looms hugely large in the legal imagination at this particular moment of the late 18th century, early 19th century. But it is thought of as implicitly or sometimes even explicitly coded as white. Citizenship is explicitly coded as white in the naturalization law of 1790. But statehood is also coded as a form of whiteness. And the challenge is that all the visions of turning Native peoples into either citizens or states are bound up with the idea of transforming them into white people in some fashion. That is through this process of civilization. And statehood would be the reward at the end of this process of civilization. So at the tail end of removal, in the tail end of the removal era, in the 1830s and 40s, there start to be serious considerations of turning what becomes the Indian Territory and ultimately Oklahoma into a state. But what's interesting is there's multiple forms of resistance. Native peoples have no real interest in becoming states. They don't want to be states because it offers this assimilationist bargain. What's also interesting is that the Southern representatives are also very opposed to the idea that Native peoples could become a state. And they explicitly say in the legislative history on the halls of Congress, if Native peoples become a state, then Haiti will become a state and we will have a Black state. So from the very beginning, the idea of having an indigenous state is bound up with the ideas of sort of racial supremacy. It does have an interesting sort of afterlife with the state of Sequoia, where as Oklahoma becomes a state, the people in the Eastern Indian Territory float the idea of an indigenous state, Sequoia. But even then, it's sort of a last-ditch effort to ward off colonialism that is still dies in some ways because of it's bound up with the project of assimilation. So part of the challenge is that it's very hard for Anglo-Americans to envision a place for Native peoples within those formal political structures that don't involve them giving up the idea of Native peoples as a separate sovereign apart from and outside the sort of structures of whiteness.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It seems right to me. And I'm excited to talk more about that. But I want to go back to this sort of federal resource point, because I think you point out very, correctly that, and for those of you who didn't read this sort of early part of the property chapters that that I'm referring to, Greg describes, this concept of a federal government, which can provide sort of money and, usually sort of court systems or other types of law that would sort of be deciding these kinds of claims, whether it's with a paper title, et cetera, as kind of a resource that territorial citizens, how do you pronounce it? It's not habitants, which is how I would read it because I'm habitants, right? Yeah. French. So habitants would and Native people would be sort of going to utilize, and that what's great about I think you putting forward that frame is that it removes the idea that they're going to the federal government because they believe in federal power or federal authority, or that they're sanctioning federal power or federal authority. Rather, it's just that it's a tool. It's something that's useful for them, that helps them, win a fight in the present moment with their neighbors, which is what they care about the most. And I think that distinction is really important because, losing sight of that and instead focusing on all of these times when folks in these territories are, running to the federal government, to get good title or to adjudicate a dispute, as instances of them saying, like, we believe in your power as supreme, is like not the way to understand, not the correct way to understand what they're doing. And that seems right. But it's also, I think, then sort of striking and like a little bit in tension with then what happens after statehood, right? Because, the second that white citizens become, white citizens of a state, of Tennessee, then they have this concept of state sovereignty and this like other option where they can be making like, yes, constitutional claims, that sound at this sort of high level of the Constitution, but still they're saying, our state courts should be the ones who can adjudicate this title now. And, that seems like remarkably savvy of them, like comparatively. And so, when I was reading these early chapters talking about Native nations going to federal authorities, like that made perfect sense to me. I was like, yeah, they're totally, I think that's right. But then once I got later on, I kind of was like, I had this sort of darn like, instinct where it seemed that there was this, I don't know if it's foresight that the state citizens seem to have. I don't know if it's legal savvy, or are they just differently situated within the Constitution. It's a little bit of a puzzle. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
So I do. I mean, I think one of the things that I would stress more than you just did in the comments is, I mean, you briefly alluded to the fact that in some ways what the state is doing is, even when it's demanding its autonomy, is making a claim on the federal government. And I think that's what I would stress, right? That one of the things that's striking to me about the post-territorial history of these states is that they still need the federal government to go and vindicate their autonomy. In other words, all this language about state sovereignty and autonomy is necessary because they need the federal government to vindicate their state sovereignty and autonomy. And they demand that they recognize their ownership, but they have to do so, they have to get the federal government to acknowledge that ownership. And so all these fights are still happening sort of within the confines of this federal adjudicatory power that states really wish they could escape, but can't. And I think one of the interesting things, one of the most striking things, is that states keep trying to push almost a treaty model of federalism. In other words, in the same way that the federal government negotiates with Native nations on a sort of position of two sovereigns coming together to negotiate and work out an agreement in a treaty, Tennessee and these other states keep appointing commissioners to go meet with the federal government as if it was a sort of treaty, almost like the kind of nation-to-nation relationship of Native peoples to the United States. But they fail, right? Like every time the federal government says, no, we're just going to pass a statute, and then the statute will be law, and maybe you'll get what you want, but like, we didn't negotiate with you, we told you what it's going to be. And so I think that itself is a sort of continued federal adjudicatory role, even though states are very good at gaming that system. I mean, I think what's striking is that states, yes, they're savvy, I think in some significant ways, but they also have the advantage of they have Andrew Jackson in the halls of Congress, who is very loud and very obnoxious. And the people on the other side don't care enough to fight for it, right? I mean, so for me, one of the interesting moments is the fight over the Cherokee Nation's territory in the late 1790s. And since, for those of you who didn't read the book, right, the federal government is actually sending troops to try to protect the Cherokees and evict squatters. But ultimately, President John Adams backs off. He says, he basically makes the decision that he cares less about the Cherokee Nation than he does about placating the people in Tennessee. The Cherokee Nation isn't in the halls of Congress. It isn't in the federal government to make that call, right? Andrew Jackson he can make life very difficult for John Adams. And so John Adams makes the politically strategic decision to give the white Tennesseans what they want.
Yeah, and it does seem like a striking moment from the earlier periods when they were, I mean, not on like precisely equal footing, but like more equal footing than as just, you know, citizens of territory. Well, as citizens and non-citizens of territory. But okay, so I want to pivot a bit to sort of talking about race and how things get sort of explicitly, like who gets raced in this narrative and who doesn't, and also, you know, the way that certain things get raced in a really interesting way. You know, we already talked a little bit, and I want to come back to the idea of like federal aid and how that gets raced, because I think that's really fascinating and very prescient for you know, things today. But I was also, again, like really struck by the habitat. I'm not going to get it right.
Yes, habitants, yes.
Habitants. And sort of why, you know, how they don't get as raced as I kind of expected. You know, there are these French, these mixed sort of French native communities that are these, you know, creations of this border world that have sort of created their own, it seems like, legal systems that are like these fusions of native and French law, but it seems like they get the complete benefit of their Frenchness in the eyes of the United States. And that was really surprising to me. I did not expect that. It seemed like I was ready for them to get, you know, treated as more native like or native corrupted communities. And so, you know, what do you think, you know, why do you think they don't get raced in the same way?
Yeah, so the habitants are fascinating for precisely this reason. And I think we have to remember that by this point, there's already a pretty robust idea of white people as defined against Native people, and also as defined against Black people that's floating around. And so the Anglo-Americans who show up in these French communities have that sort of racial typology in their minds. And what's interesting is on the ground, they constantly do talk about them as degraded in this racial typology in precisely the way that you've described. In other words, they often describe them as effectively, they envision them as being native, and talk about them. They apply many of the derogatory views that Anglo-Americans have toward native folks toward these habitants. So why then does that not translate into federal policy? I think there are a couple of reasons. One, unlike Native peoples, there's no nation you can plausibly say that the habitants belong to, right? In other words, they don't have a political separate and political sovereignty in the same way. And so Native peoples are fit pretty neatly in this period as non-citizens who belong to these sovereign entities outside the United States. In other words, the sort of political, not racial idea that we're familiar with from current federal Indian law, I actually think it has a great, or I would say political and racial. In other words, these two are mutually overlapping at this particular moment. And the habitants, they are the legacy of this other empire, but that empire has gone. And that means that they have to slot into one of these existing sovereignties, and the sovereignty that they slot into is the United States. And more than that, the United States is eager to sort of recruit them as white people. Because if they can be recruited as white people, they can be part of the process of extending federal power and authority into borderlands. Because then these people are already there, right? They're one of the handful of communities that are already there. And so if they can secure their allegiance and support for the United States and not one of the other competing powers, then that actually is an advantage. We have to remember that the United States is deeply anxious that not only that native power will outcompete federal power in this space, but also that, you know, British or Spanish power will do so as well. And so I think part of what's going on here is the United States is making a bid for the by making these people white. They're offering the bargain that the United States offered to many groups that were not previously considered white, right? They are offering them the privileges of whiteness in return for supporting and buying into the structures of exclusion.
Yeah, that's interesting. My intuition was that it had something to do with like the legacy of France, something, but that's much more, that answer makes sense, and this book seems better. I also want to talk a bit about this practice of retaliation and territorial violence, because it seems also very, it's very fascinating and has this very racial lens to it. So it seems that, this concept of retaliation, which is itself, it seems like it's something that is both real, but like not as important as it is, as it seems in Native communities, as a way of adjudicating cross-cultural disputes in particular, that, if you, and the idea is that like sort of if you get, if there is violence on your community, you will just like impose in-kind violence, not necessarily on the guilty, but just like in kind on the offending community. And it seems to, and then it gets sort of adopted though by the territorial citizens who seem to be also like a big fan of it. And so that had this really interesting like playing Indian kind of vibe to it. And so I wonder, like, do you think of it in those terms as well, as that there's this, that it's an instance not just of folks on the border not understanding what's happening in terms of Native law, but also sort of like using these Native concepts to get away with conduct in ways that their like whiteness would otherwise not allow. And how does like that, because that was fascinating, that they were like, oh, this is we're gonna do it too, this is how this is gonna work because this is how the savages do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really apt way of describing it. I think that's, I sort of wish I had that as I was writing the book. Why did I didn't meet you 2 years ago, Liz? One of the things that I think that underscores is like how central Indigenous law was to so much of what is going on here, right? But Indigenous law as often misunderstood by outsiders. So I think we often have this story that like, oh, white people came in and they just sought to erase Indigenous law and didn't recognize it. But I think this underscores a much more complicated story, which is that they were really eager to try to understand and adopt Indigenous law, but this wasn't like some disinterested project to try to understand this. They sort of seized on trying to grasp Indigenous law and use it for their own purposes. And I think the retaliation is a great example of that, because it's a pretty distorted and vast oversimplification of Indigenous law. But the other thing that's interesting about it is it becomes, as you say, a sort of syncretic legal culture of the borderlands. Some of it is a sort of form of playing Indian, but I also think part of it is also an idea that there is that the presence of indigenous peoples itself is justification for a different legal culture. That, in other words, it's a justification for a legal culture that wouldn't apply in Philadelphia, let's say, but that in the territories or in the borderlands, maybe more specifically, things operate differently. And so partially it's a racial concept because it's about the presence of indigenous peoples, but it's also sort of a geographical concept, right? It's about what it means to be in this place of the borderlands. And what's fascinating to me is they constantly say, you people in Philadelphia, you just don't understand because you don't live here. You don't understand Native peoples, but also you don't understand like how things are done in this place.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question before we go back to, before we take some general questions from the audience. So I want to circle back to then this point about money. So you have this, line in the early introduction of, not for the first or not for the last time in US history, some of the loudest critics of federal power were amongst its greatest beneficiaries. And that pose, I think, talks about, those who are like wielding like federal power, like people who are kind of walking contradictions, like Andrew Jackson, who are like US senators who are also like, federal power is the like worst thing in the world. But also a lot of these territorial citizens who are in this position of benefiting tremendously economically from the United States, but who also, project this very like racialized lens on the aid that Native communities are seeing and are receiving, and seem to be really selectively seeing the picture of both, like what aid is, but in the first place, but also, what the need, how that need came about. And, it seems that, there is this racial lens, and I've been really sort of struggling for a better word than like trying like this blend of like race and respectability that gets sort of projected onto how folks are seeing federal funds flow to Native people versus the entire economy of the territories seeming to be propped up by federal jobs. And I'm sort of struggling for a better word for that. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that dynamic, or like the limits of our like maybe current vocabulary to sort of capture this phenomenon of like the intersection of sort of race and class, and what we see as sort of socially justifiable or legitimate in terms of someone's poverty.
So I think the literature on this topic, and there's a large literature on the sort of rise of the welfare state that I am only passingly familiar with and drew a little bit on in dealing with that question. But it talks about this, I think, in some ways, in thinking about the language of rights and entitlement, right? And I do think that helps capture something, because what Native peoples are perceived by white people to be calling for is not about rights, right? It's sort of largesse or charity, or it's about the fact that they're dependent, right? And that they're weak and that they're helpless. And, these are tropes that are very familiar to us as scholars of federal Indian law. But when territorial citizens engage in this, right, they are sort of, first of all, there's a gendered component that I think is important to stress about. It's bound up with a language of masculinity. It's also bound up with the martial virtues of service, right? They are in the militia, so it's a masculine narrative. But it's about sort of the reciprocal relationship between the state and the citizen. And it gets bound up in that sort of political language, but also very much in the language of, which is also a political language, but also a legal language of rights, right? That the federal government is obligated to provide them this because of, here's a document, here's a contract, and actually they explicitly imagined the Constitution as a contract, right? They imagine that the federal government is obliged under the terms of this to provide them with things. And so I think that language helps formulate a little bit about how they managed to craft and envision this relationship that casts only Native peoples as sort of supposedly feminized and dependent and weak and reliant, and this whole panoply of adjectives that get applied to that relationship, whereas they manage to evade that language for themselves, even though, as we see, actually, oftentimes they don't, right? That they get described as children and they really don't like it. That the vocabulary and the metaphors of paternalism show up for the territorial residents as well, and boy, do they hate it. I found that pretty interesting, in part because the literature on Native history is focused so heavily on paternalism and its meaning within the context of the relationship between Native peoples and the federal government, all the language about fathers, et cetera. It was striking to see that in this other context as well.
Yeah, and I also liked the bit where you included that there had to be like this moment of transition for Native folks who were from matrilineal societies, and so this sort of like gendering that was happening, which wasn't like not translating initially because of this cross-cultural difference. It's like a moment that I thought was particularly fascinating. So, okay, so with that, I think we're going to kick it over to Alfredo to ask some things from the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg and Liz, for this stimulating dialogue about an important book that in my mind raises essential questions about statehood, federalism, and politics. We have a few questions that we'll share with you. The first one alludes to what is described as the spirit of party, and it reads, especially where the Republican Party has gotten so extreme today that it's destroying our democracy. Washington advocated spirit of nation over it. Are there any good examples of this in the past? Has such extreme tensions, gridlock happened in the past, and what lessons are there?
Well, I mean, that takes me a little bit outside the bounds of the book. Obviously, the people who study Civil War probably have more things to say about this. Although I will say that people in the 1790s, the white people in the United States thought that the stakes of their politics were existential, that there was incredible fighting between the political parties, that they neither of them necessarily thought of themselves as legitimate, and a number of people have thought about this in that sense. I also want to stress that I think for Native peoples, the stakes of politics really were existential, and I think that's something to stress as important background to this book, right? That for Native peoples, the history and story that I'm trying to recount was a story that on which the very survival of them as peoples and as individuals depended, right? That this was a, and so I think that some of that extreme urgency and, I think is captured in how Native leaders are trying to navigate this exceptionally difficult political world, because the stakes were amazingly high for them, much higher, it's clear, than for the white politicians who thought that everything in this early decade was about the very survival of the United States. Of course, in hindsight, that becomes clear that that's not the case. But I think emphasizing just how much everybody at the time thought the stakes were high, but for that Native peoples, the stakes really were existential.
Thank you for that. And I neglected to say that the question came from Puneet Sharma. The next one comes from Brooke Thompson. Was there anything that came up to you as particularly surprising, not talked about enough when doing the research for this book?
So thanks for the question, Brooke. Brooke, one of my former students. Great to see you. So a couple of things. I mean, one, I would just reiterate the point that that I just made in my conversation with Liz, that actually Indigenous law loomed larger in writing this book than I think it does in our stories of the past. That it was that the federal government and white people actually had to grapple with and try to understand this category. Not well, but they had to grapple with it. The other thing that I at least came away thinking was important is that we constantly, we have, I think, an impoverished vision of the founding and constitutional meaning and constitutional history. And here I'll just give an anecdote where I presented one chapter of the book, the chapter on war, at Harvard, and someone from the audience said, like, okay, I understand there's these people, the white people in the territories, arguing about what the Constitution means, but you argue that actually Native peoples were arguing about what the Constitution means as well. But like, did they really have thoughts and views about the Constitution? Were they really arguing about the Constitution? And my answer is yes. Like, that, I think, is one of the things I'm trying to show in the book, is that they might not have been doing it in the same way that their white neighbors were, but that the meaning of the Constitution was not crafted by James Madison sitting in a room in Philadelphia while talking to Benjamin Franklin. And the power that they had to decide the meaning of the political system of the United States was actually pretty limited, and that constitutional meaning happened in lots of places where they had no control over how that meaning was shaped and defined. And I think that I think is, I hope, one of the insights that the book helps reiterate.
Great. If I may, let me ask Liz the same question. Was there anything particularly surprising to you?
Yeah, no, there were several moments where I think that one that, well, I will admit, that was sort of surprising to me, and also that, like, I can imagine like made me feel like immediately both like annoyed at myself, and I imagine that you probably feel annoyed constantly, Greg, is that the discussion of treatying, in addition, like, and how expensive it was really interesting and new to me, and not something I'd really thought about. And I think for a lot of not just Native scholars, but just like Native people, like, we grow up around this rhetoric of sort of the promises of treaties and how they've all been broken, and and when we think about what those promises are, it's very much like what was in the text, and like what that annuity was, like what the money that was actually promised in that document was. And so it was just fascinating to learn that, like, that money as promised was just this like tiny fraction of the expense of actually conducting these treaty making affairs with Native nations, and that they were actually sort of these, it seems like instead creating these more sort of elaborate systems where they were benefiting tremendously from their continued relationship with the federal government, where they were basically like, have everybody, like, pay for all of our travel, put us all up. Like, it seems like they were having these very expensive conferences where they were also like leaving with like a bunch of stuff. And like, as someone who's now, like, put on conferences, plan them, like, it suddenly, of course, like, I know, like, that's really expensive. And so it just made me realize that we have such like a limited picture of what these promises cost, like what they were, what was really going on, the power dynamics there. And so, like, the idea that, Native people sort of showed up and got, like, frankly, just like screwed over by this totally crap deal that still got broken is just it's so wrong. And it must drive you crazy every time that people refer to, like, the pittance of funds that folks were promised in treaties, as if that was like the full story of what was going on in these moments. And it definitely is making me think differently already. So
thank you for that. The next question I posed in the chat, and it's about the main arguments of the book. They seem to make visible the entanglements of space, empire, native dispossession, and the nature of American government. What would you like your readers to learn about the meanings of those ideas?
Oh, small question there, Alfredo.
Very small. Yes.
In one sentence. No.
Plastics. No, that's a graduate reference. I realize I'm dating myself there. On one level, right, of course, the stock historian answer is that it's complicated, and the book sort of tries to complicate everything and say that it's messy. But I also don't want that to be, I hope that the book offers more than just messing up the tidy stories that we have. I come back to the emphasis on politics that I alluded to earlier, right? That like this is a deeply and profoundly political process. And the results, were not necessary. There were deep structural inequalities in the way that Liz and I were just talking about earlier, but the results were not foreordained either, right? That there was nothing inevitable about the path that empire and dispossession took, and that these were choices that the United States made, right? Both to build the structures and then to choose and engage in the policies that it made. And then the other thing is, I think we also have to recognize that collectively we as a society made these choices, right? I think focusing on people like Andrew Jackson or the Severes of the world is convenient sometimes, and they become symbols for this broader history. But I also think we have to recognize that they exercise power because they actually spoke persuasively for a large number of people, right? And that it was actually a choice that many citizens of the United States made to engage in these policies, and that that it was a political choice that we made collectively through our system of government. And I think that's something really important to remember as we grapple with some of the legacies of that history today.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We have a little more than 10 minutes, and we have 2 more questions. So I want to make sure that we cover them. The next one comes from our colleague, Ramon Saldivar, and it reads, speaking about Indian removal and other racist political practices as instances of structural inequality seems so euphemistic and anachronistic. What difference will it make to the historiography of late 18th and early 19th century US history to use different terms for describing these racist practices of exclusion, terms such as white supremacy or apartheid? Would that change in terminology, change the ways we view ideas of state powers and federalism of that period?
So I want to pick up on what I think is a tension in the question, right? So I think that is absolutely right, and I think I alluded to this earlier, that things like removal is euphemistic. In fact, scholars have proposed various alternatives, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But in some ways, it's not anachronistic, right? In fact, it's the opposite of anachronistic in the sense that these were euphemisms that white people used at the time to make themselves feel more comfortable about the violence that they were engaged in. So Indian removal was the term of the era for this process. It comes from the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And so I think the question is not, the question is not about anachronism, but actually the reverse. In other words, what damage or even violence are we doing if we borrow the terms of the era to describe what was going on? Because of course, apartheid is not obviously a term that was being used in the time period, nor for that matter is white supremacy. White supremacy is a term that shows up later on. There are certainly things that we can point to as white supremacist during this time period, and whiteness was ubiquitous, as was the idea of white people. So I think the question is something that all historians have to grapple with, which is, when is it appropriate to sort of move beyond the euphemisms of the particular era, ones that masked or avoided violence in particular, and adopt a more forthright language. And I think one of the things that has become to be used in place of removal is talking about mass deportation. I think that plays an important role in acknowledging that this is a coercive process, a violent process. Claudio Sant, in his excellent book, uses that language, and I think persuasively. The other term that is widely discussed and debated is, of course, the term genocide for this process. And that's been an ongoing and roiling debate in early American history for quite a while. My own view on this is shaped by scholars like Ben Madley and Jeffrey Ostler, who I think have made a couple persuasive arguments. One, I think Ben Madley persuasively demonstrates that certainly what happened in California fits the legal definition of genocide. I think that what he also speaks about genocidal acts that were committed throughout US history against Native peoples, and I think that's accurate. And in the book, I actually use the term genocidal acts to describe the violence that the militia commits against Cherokees and other indigenous groups. And I think that's important to use that language and terminology. The other thing that Jeff Ostler points to is the idea of Native perceptions of genocide. In other words, the idea of the language of extirpation and extermination that was ubiquitous during this time period, and that Native peoples perceived in this area, or that white people were using toward them. And I think that also is a valuable intervention in flipping the script and focusing not on what the intentions, or we can argue about them, but thinking about the experiences and perceptions of Native peoples and how they experience this history. So I think there's real value, but of course, like all terms, there's a stakes and a politics to thinking about them that need to be thought about carefully. And I think historians always have to strike this balance of importing terms that would have been foreign to the actors at the time, but also using them to try to capture processes that at the time, terms like removal, perhaps obscured. I have yet to find a better term than structure, I will say, which we've used a lot, and but I do feel like it does help capture some of the complexities and some of the dynamics that we're trying to capture here. I'd be open to other terms, but I'm not sure structure is a synonym for white supremacy or apartheid. I think you can talk about white supremacist structures, and I would certainly argue and concede that these are white supremacist structures. I won't argue. I think that's the evidence fully supports that conclusion.
Yes, thank you. And I invite everyone to add comments in the chat if you have any responses or thoughts to some of the ideas that Greg and Liz have shared in the last segment of the event. The last question comes from our colleague and director of CSRE, Paula Moya. She said the Faustian bargain that was offered to the habitant is interesting. It reminds me a bit of how Mexican Americans were treated in the Southwest. So when Texas was required to desegregate schools, they took advantage of the fact that the Mexican Americans were classified by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as white. The tactic was often to classify the Mexicans as white and then putting them in schools with Blacks and calling the school integrated. And she closes her comment with the statement that reads, "I want to thank you both for your engagement with each other's ideas. It is a joy to watch." So I think it's more of a reflection, but I'm sure that you may have some interesting reactions to that, Greg, if you wish.
Yeah, I actually think it's not simply a parallel, but actually part of a continuous history. In other words, I think that the story of Latinx peoples grows out in some ways from those stories of the early habitants in a couple ways. One, the precedent of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo draws from the Treaty of Paris and then the Louisiana Purchase, which makes the decision to make the existing supposedly white or Euro-American residents of these annexed territories citizens of the United States and sort of make them honorary white people. So that precedent actually plays out in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. And then the other thing that I'll stress is this process of determining who owns what land, where the federal government came in and adjudicated pre-existing land titles, particularly the habitants' land titles, actually becomes the precedent and gets codified and hardened into law. And the same process actually unfolds in California in the 1850s and in the Southwest throughout much of the late 19th century. So in other words, it's literally the same kinds of practices and laws from this period that are being applied to those Latinx communities. And you actually have similar histories of dispossession, right? That are probably more familiar to those of you who study, those Latinx communities in the Southwest. But the dispossession of the communal land grants in places like New Mexico and Arizona grows out of the same history of federal officials adjudicating and often minimizing the habitants' land claims in the early period, in the late 18th, early 19th centuries.
Great. We're getting close to the end of our session. I want to give you and Liz a chance to make any final statements or reflections you want to share before we start saying goodbye.
Liz, do you want to go first? I'll throw you in the hot seat.
Thanks. So I think that one of the, especially a lot of these questions have, definitely pointed an arrow from the book forward, both in terms of across the United States and also in time. And I think that is been, great and exciting, and it's definitely true. But one of the things that I want to end on is that a lot of my favorite parts of the book were the little pieces that had this sort of disruptive effect, like I talked about in my initial remarks, of like making me think differently about how things are or could have been. When we got to the part towards the end when they were trying to decide on the boundaries for Tennessee statehood, and there was the idea in Congress, debated in Congress, that it might make more sense for the state of Tennessee to be a third the size that it is, because the other 2/3 were actually native land, and that would probably be a cleaner way to do things. Like I kind of went like, what? Because it does seem like that is it just seems sort of shocking that would have been true. And so I think that that's also revealing how much the way that we think about like history, even our contemporary legal structures, as sort of the products of this history, has this just like unassailable inevitability to it that is like so constructed by like what we're exposed to versus what we're not. And so I'm really thankful that like works like this are doing the like good and hard work of exposing us to all of these important alternative details in how these things unfolded, because they're really important, I think, in how we're thinking about who we are and how we got here.
Wow, I shouldn't have had you go first. That was a way too thoughtful and insightful remark, and I think that's absolutely right. I'll just close by saying it's a real pleasure to be able to share something that I worked on, somewhat. So I found myself, in these random archives in Tennessee and Indiana, and these little small towns trying to uncover this history. And, you never know when you're doing that work, like how it will matter, who will care about this, how much does getting this particular fact right matter? And it's a solitary process, right? You're just sort of in your own head and with the sources for a long time. And so it's really gratifying to have other people sort of engaged so deeply and thoughtfully with the work, to see the importance in the things that have preoccupied me for a long time. And I will actually flip a little bit on Liz's remark, because I think you're absolutely right. And that's exactly the sensibility that historians are so encouraged to cultivate, right? The strangeness and pastness of the past, the idea of contingency and uncertainty. The flip side of that was the uncanny feeling I had when I was writing the book that a lot of this was not even a history at all, right? That the book, the arguments that were, when I was working on, Supreme Court cases that are being litigated now, I saw the resonances and echoes of this history, even if not acknowledged and thought about. And so, maybe this is what happens if you're a historian and you write a book, is that the whole world starts to look like your book. But I don't think it was entirely that. I do think part of it is, I hope that I've tapped into something that tells us something meaningful about why we are where we are now, why some features of the world look the way that they do, and help us think hard about what the federal government's relationship to Native peoples looked like, and maybe think about different ways of what it should look like, and think about how a past of failed good intentions doesn't have to be replicated in the present. So that's my hope for the book. But thank you again to all of you for this incredibly thoughtful and deep engagement with the work. I'm really appreciative.
Big insights and lots to think about. So we appreciate it. And on behalf of CCSRE, Greg, we congratulate you again on the publication of your book. Liz, your thoughtful engagement and response was very helpful and stimulating as well. You have our gratitude for such a inspiring dialogue today, and we look forward to having you involved in future events. For all of our colleagues and friends joining us today, remember January 18th at noon, Michael Wilcox will give a research talk on narratives, sovereignty, and the politics of erasure. Take care, everyone.